Welcome, everyone. I'm Carol Becker, Dean of Columbia University School of the Arts. I begin by recognizing Manhattan as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger people. By acknowledging legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement that allow us to gather as we do, the school is taking a small step towards the long and overdue process of healing and repair. Repair is our public program and engagement concept for this year and next, traversing media and disciplines, conversations, films, theatrical presentations, events, and podcasts. We have explored and will continue to explore creative practices that engage social and political initiatives committed to reimagining and transforming our frayed relationships between humans, other species, the planet, and ourselves. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce two of our truly fabulous faculty members at the School of the Arts, Tom Kalin and Aliza Nisenbaum, who will be in conversation about Aliza's work in our intra-school series that we call Complex Issues. I'm going to briefly introduce them to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. And after they converse, there will be a Q&A, so please remember to put your questions in the question box. We will welcome them. I'm going to begin my introductions with Tom Kalin, who is Professor of Professional Practice in the film program at Columbia University School of the Arts. His film Swoon was awarded prizes in Berlin, Stockholm, Sundance, and the Gotham Awards. And his film Savage Grace premiered in Cannes, screened worldwide, and was named top 10 by Artforum. As a producer, his films include I Shot Andy Warhol and Go Fish. And he also was co-writer of Cindy Sherman's Office Killer. Kalin was a founding member of the now very famous AIDS activist collective Grand Fury, which exhibited in the Venice Biennale and is in the collections of the Whitney, MoMA, and the Smithsonian. With frequent collaborator Dove Mann, Thomas Bartlett, Kalin exhibited in 2015 at Participant Gallery with the live installation My Silent One in the Sweetness of Time and at Dublin's National Concert Hall. He is a Rockefeller and Guggenheim Fellow, has twice been included in the Whitney Biennale, and has screened in venues including the ICA London, the Reina Sofia, the Cartier Foundation, Red Cat, MoMA, the Getty Museum, among many, many others. He received the Pride Award from the 2020 Ashland Independent Film Festival, and he recently directed the first episode of Pride, a 6-part documentary series for the FX networks about LGBTQ civil rights in America. So something to truly look forward to. Now I go to Aliza. Born in Mexico City, Eliza Nissenbaum makes portrait paintings that are the manifestation of exchanges with her subjects that take place over time. Collaborating with distinct communities, she employs the focused attention of observational painting to create the conditions for close looking. Distinct social groups are at the foreground of her work, including undocumented immigrants, dancers, members of grassroots organizations, subway and health workers. She engages with these groups on various levels, sharing resources, skills, and ultimately social representation. Her lengthy engagement with her subjects allows her to understand their histories and their dignity beyond the space of portraiture. Often lushly decorated with patterned textiles found in her sitters' homes and tiles from workplace settings, she makes visible the material conditions, friendships, and alliances of particular work and leisure environments. Nissenbaum's current exhibition at the Tate Liverpool features a series of new portraits of UK healthcare workers. In 2019, she completed a residency and public mural project for the Art on the Underground Commission in London. Recent solo shows also include Anton Kern Gallery in New York, which is the gallery that represents her work, and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Eliza's work has been included in many notable group exhibitions at the ICA Boston, the Renaissance Society, Chicago, the Musée d'Arte de Sao Paulo, the Drawing Center, New York, the New Britain Museum, Connecticut, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. She has also presented her work at the Whitney Biennale, New York, the Biennale of the Americas, the MCA Denver, and the Rufino Tamayo Painting Biennale in Mexico City. Her work is found in many collections, including those of the Tate, the Ashby Foundation, the Hirshhorn Museum, the Cadiz Foundation, the Rennie Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. I'm now going to turn this over to Aliza to begin her presentation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure to be back at Columbia and to speak with Tom Kalin, whose work I admire greatly myself. So I'd like to start by I'm going to show you a few minutes of a video I have from my current project at Tate Liverpool. As I was starting to think about this project, I was supposed to be on site last spring in Liverpool. And as things shifted very quickly, I ended up making a project that was done remotely from between Los Angeles and Liverpool. So I'd love for you guys to hear my subjects' experience in their own voice. So let me share my screen and do that. Let's see. Okay, 1 second. I use painting as a way to get to know a particular kind of workforce and environment, and use this very slow technology of observational painting to sit with a variety of different populations that maybe wouldn't get represented otherwise. I'm in Los Angeles right now, and this work is a commemoration that I've been doing towards healthcare workers in Liverpool. When I paint these small passages of people's skin, it's kind of like a reflective space where I have the memory of the conversations we had. I think about what they might be going through, how they must be on the front lines, and how they must be quite afraid. A lot of them are facing patients with COVID in their daily life. I'm thinking about them and how they must need renewal. In some ways, my painting is about the individuals and their faces, but the formal elements of the work are kind of a fleshing out of their stories.
From a very little girl, I'd always wanted to be a nurse. I don't care who you are, whether you're the Prime Minister or somebody that lives on the streets. From me, you'll get exactly the same level of care. And I think that's really, really important.
Nursing runs in my family. My mum is a nurse, and both my sisters are student nurses, and I'm also a student nurse. So I guess it's being handed down to us.
For me, it's about trying to make a difference. You get a patient who's nervous, you've got to win them over. If you get a child who's got a Liverpool shirt on, you can talk about Liverpool. If you've got an Everton shirt on, oh, we'll get you fixed, mate, don't worry.
As one of the consultants, I have to be responsible for patients that come through our department. Alder Hey Children's Hospital is one of the largest children's hospitals in Europe, and as an emergency department, one of the busiest.
When we put out the open call in Liverpool to a few different hospitals, we got a very nice response, and a few of them I'm painting individually, but I decided to keep this as a team.
I think they've tried to incorporate different departments of the hospital. So you've got myself as a porter, you've got nurses, healthcares, doctors, housekeeper, consultants.
Even though it's a painting of a large group of people that are assembled, I'm interested in those moments where there are individuals within that larger group as well. I was just interested in thinking about how to commemorate hospital workers that were working such long hours. And at the beginning of the pandemic, people were going outside and clapping for care workers.
We've all been called heroes. We're not heroes, we're just doing our job. That's the job we're in. It's the job we've always been in.
We all opted in to help out during the pandemic. We saw our mum, who's always this caring person who didn't even think about herself. And we thought, what's stopping us from helping out? Essentially, this is why we went into nursing, to help people. What better way than to start with COVID?
When the outbreak first happened, one of my daughters had to shield. One of my other daughters is a nurse on the front line. She actually got coronavirus. So there was a period of time where it was like, pick a child.
My twin sister was assigned to a COVID-19 ward. There was always a constant fear of, is she going to get it? Because she's so close, working so close to COVID-19 patients. You constantly worry, but also think this is what essentially nursing is. And this is what you're called to do, so you just do it.
When you see people dying every day, when you know your mortuary is full to capacity and you can't fit any more in, it's a very stark reality.
For the first time in my life, I had a 4-month period of not being able to touch anybody. I used to lie on the slate tiles in my kitchen, on the laminate floor in my corridor, and on different fabrics just to simulate a different sort of sensation on my skin.
We were asked to do a picture by Aliza that reflected our role. Luckily enough, my son's girlfriend, she's an artist, so she drew my picture for me.
So I wanted to show you just those few minutes of some of the people that I painted. This is an entire team that applied when we put out the open call to 3 different hospitals in Liverpool, Alderhay, the Royal, and Alderhay Children's Hospital and Wirral Hospital as well. And so this entire team applied because they wanted to be represented. And I started to really get a sense of the culture of that hospital. And they had like a kind of staff wellness program where they would ask people to share their stories, everyone from the porter, as he was saying, to the cleaning staff, to the doctors and the nurses. And since they communicate with children through art, I asked them to draw out their stories. And so Kevin was explaining that he is the person that helps children from navigate from one side of the hospital to another. And very sadly, he also shared a story about how he was the one that moved children from in their last journey to the morgue if they had to be taken there. And when he came home, he would raise a glass to cheer for them. So it was quite something to hear. This is the first time I painted remotely. So I met with each one of the sitters via Zoom, and I was painting them from Los Angeles and kind of having some back and forth with them through photographs that a photographer we hired would take over there, and then talking to them via Zoom. And so this is the hospital itself, including like the play specialist, Rose, and the doctors. And this is another group of people from that hospital that were sharing how they were dealing with the administration, how they had to rethink the hospital, how they invited adults into the hospital had to be made into an emergency ward for adults as well. And this was a billboard that they put up outside the Tate, saying thank you to the NHS, because I also did various individual watercolors of other people that were not part of this entire team. So for example, this was a man, Alan, who was a student nurse, and I started to pair these diptychs, they're kind of large scale watercolors, with images of flowers that I would find in my walks here in Los Angeles. So it was kind of a way of sending them a bouquet. And perhaps I will just read a few sentences from some of these that they sent me from their stories. So Alan told me, this is in his words, I was close to finishing my nursing degree when COVID first hit. Initially, the university closed, but healthcare students could apply for NHS placement to help with the pandemic while completing our qualifications. The day before I was due to start my placement, my sister phoned me to say that my mom's ventilator setting had been lowered, and later she passed away. I still went to my placement induction the next day, as I knew my mom would have wanted me to. When I woke up on the first morning of my placement, I noticed her hairbrush, and I put some of her hair in a locket so that I could always keep part of her close to me. I've since finished my qualifications, and I work as a nurse at Walton Center. This is Alan and his partner at the opening. I wasn't able to go, obviously, to the opening in Liverpool, but they opened the museum for each one of the sitters that were depicted, and they started to kind of realize relationships between them. You know, one of them was a professor of another one. Somebody knew each other's, partner or wife. And this was Ryan, for example, whose wife, he was another PhD student who was a respiratory doctor, and his wife gave birth during the time of the pandemic. This is Navina, whose words you heard at the beginning of the video. Her whole family decided to opt in during the pandemic, and her mother is also a nurse, and she has cousins who are doctors as well. She had just graduated, and so part of her initial placement training was also going straight into the COVID wards. She was about to go and travel the world, but instead she opted in. Her entire family opted in. This is Shari, who was an intensive care, nurse taking a break by the water. Her and her partner adopted a child. She's originally from the Philippines, but I guess because of the travel ban to the UK during the time, her partner was not able to join her, and so she was on her own working these very long shifts. This was Stephen, who worked as an eye doctor for children mostly, and when I talked to him, he told me that he and his partner have a yoga studio, so he wanted to be depicted with these kind of amazing peacock curtains of his yoga studio. And he told me that when he had patients come to his office, he would start making these awards for children where he would ask them what their favorite color was or what their favorite superhero was, and then he'd send them to the parents by email, and how much the children enjoyed that. So I was very interested in seeing both the people I worked in their kind of work environment and making a picture of them and thinking about how they assembled in their workforce, as well as in their private sphere, such as in this image, where I get a kind of sense of how they find renewal to go out into these difficult jobs. This was another woman, Jessica, and perhaps I'll read her text to me. I'm training to be a nurse, and I was on placement at hospital at the start of the pandemic. As there is a huge shortage of nurses, I decided to keep working, and it was a proper learning experience. The clapping for the NHS on Thursday evenings was amazing. I loved it, but there is not enough government support for staff working on the ground. It was hard to hear that nurses would not be given a pay raise, because as nice as the clapping was, it won't pay the bills. My Nan is my inspiration. In the 1950s, she married a Nigerian man while living in a very white industrial mining town, so I salute her for her bravery. They had 3 children, including twins, but he left her, so she had to raise them by herself. Like me, she went back to college to study nursing at a slightly older age, while taking life drawing classes in the evenings. She inspired me to become a nurse, and she, along with my eldest daughter, who was a budding artist herself, is the reason I wanted to take part in this project. A lot of the people that I decided to paint from the open call also had a lot of curiosity in the arts. So that was very interesting to get the back and forth with them as well about how they would be depicted, and to ask them about how, what setting they wanted to choose for their backgrounds. This was a Reverend Jackie, who was a hospital chaplain, and she was also telling me about how difficult it was for her to not be able to have physical contact with patients, and how in the end she ended up supporting the staff very much in the hospital where she was working. This is Callum. Perhaps I'll read his text to me as well. I am one of thousands of people who are part of the research attempt to beat this virus. In previous outbreaks, clinical researchers have been deeply frustrated by our inability to mount a rapid response. A group of us set up a global organization called ISARIC in 2011, which identified the need to set up hibernating research studies in readiness for a future outbreak. Previously, it took at least 3 months to activate a study. For COVID-19, it took one phone call because of our preparations. We were able to recruit the very first cases here and in other countries. I also just heard from Callum that he was knighted by the Queen of England because of his effort. He was part of the SAGE effort to help with, as he said, mobilize during the pandemic. So during the opening, it was quite moving that Callum decided to bring his bagpipe to be photographed in front of this like wall, very large wall hanging of all the drawings. This is another nurse who had, her name is Anne, and you heard her speak as well in the video. She had been a nurse for almost 30 years working in addiction, with addiction patients. And she was telling me how, I mean, her family was so worried for her to go into the hospital during this time. And perhaps this is the last short excerpt I'll read. Emily, who was a critical care nurse. I was working as a critical care nurse during the COVID pandemic. We converted our unit into an intensive care unit. It was challenging because we don't usually look after those types of patients, but we had to. We had ventilated patients on our unit for about 2 months, which was a very intense time. We did 12-hour shifts, and I ended up on 6 weeks of night shifts. Nothing resembled normality. Everyone was wearing full PPE. You couldn't recognize anyone. We would wear PPE for 4 or 5 hours at a time without eating or drinking or going to the bathroom, because you were aware of not wanting to use extra PPE if you had to take it off. Though most of it was running on adrenaline, it's only now that I've got time to process it. Now there's a lot of us who experience trauma, like flashbacks, and emotions that are very close to the surface. Of course, it was horrible, but I was glad to be able to be part of it and do something. I was very proud of our unit and how well everyone adapted, our team spirit and our camaraderie. So Emily was also telling me that she would go in her off times to go rock climbing. So it was interesting, the kind of intensity that she said that she did in her time off rock climbing. I think I'll show you a few other works that I did prior to this work, and then Tom will join us and join me in conversation. So this is a project I did in 2019 where I was stationed to work in Brixton Station. Here's the mural that I did. I lived in Brixton, which is the hub of the Victoria Line in London, for about 3 months, and my studio was located in the back of the station. So even though the passengers that were going into the underground couldn't see me working, everyone that worked as staff in the station could see me working on their painting, and they each came and sat for me. And the painting ended up being kind of a temporal recording of the experience that takes to get on the tube, you know, the mind the gap yellow line, the floor with its speckled surface once you're inside the subway, and then the textiles that I found in the Transport Museum in London, as well as the icon for Brixton Station. And I have this most of the time when I work from life. It's kind of an experiment, and sitting with somebody and having these intimate conversations with them, because it's unlike other ways in which you interact with somebody. You're looking at every part of their skin and painting the passages of light and warm hitting their skin, of course. And I was there during the time where Brexit was being voted on for the first time, and they each told me their political stance. But I feel that this kind of sitting face to face with somebody is unlike the way there can be kind of very polarizing views on social media or other ways when we dehumanize people. It's kind of an exercise in really getting to know someone and understanding what particular politics might mean to them. This is another painting from that series. This is a woman, Desi, who I paired with these historic posters that I found at the Transport Museum of women who had designed posters over the past 100 years for the underground, like the saying of wear or carry something white during the Blitz, or, you know, all the posters signifying the theater and other designs. This is another project I did for the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where I was invited to kind of collaborate and work with people who were around the community of the Minneapolis Institute. But I thought we should start kind of looking inwards at the museum itself. So I ended up painting the guards, and I was invited to their kind of morning briefing in the basement, which they called their pet lounge basement, because they each had a photo of themselves with their pets. And being Minneapolis, some of them had like a cow or a snake pet. And so it was a very interesting experience of being kind of seeing the back operations of the museum. I also worked with a group of women at a community center called Hope Community Center, who has like a project for a teaching garden and basically kind of services for food justice. And these women tended to that garden, and then they could take the produce and make use of it. And this young woman, Bisharo, was my painting assistant during the time, because she also was interested in either studying psychology or going into art. This was another group I worked with during the time where I showed, where I did a portraiture class with members, seniors from Centro Tirón Guzmán. And so I decided to depict them with their portraits, very much like what I ended up doing with Alder Hay with healthcare workers. And in the background of this center, which is kind of the oldest Latino community center in Minneapolis, there was a portrait of kind of chronicling farm labor to Minneapolis. And I'll show you a few slides that were kind of the beginning point that started me on this mode of working with particular communities, and then using painting as a way of having them be the first witnesses to the work's creation. So this is Veronica, who was the first model I painted in 2012 when I was volunteering at Immigrant Movement International in Queens with Tania Bruguera. And I told Tania that I really wanted to be part of her community. And so I asked her, how can I contribute? And she told me, why don't you teach a class? What we most need here is like English language skills. So I told her that I'd teach a class that was basically feminist art history through English through feminist art history. So then after teaching that class and taking my students to the Met for the first time, some of them, I just got very inspired by their stories. And so I asked them if they would sit for me so that I could paint them from life. And so the community space itself became like a kind of confluence of teaching kids that would come and hang out with their parents or wait for their mothers. And then I started to get to know the husbands as well. And, you know, it was the first time I worked in such a public setting. And so this is like one of the first models that I painted, Atanasio, who I painted with his stubble one day. And then he came back the next day, he wanted to be painted with his ostrich leather boots and belt. And again, the same family who I've been painting, who I've known now for about 8 years, Gustavo, Marisa, and Veronica, and who joined me with in front of their painting at the Whitney Biennial. Veronica led a group of kids through a kind of youth justice tour, talking about the work that she does in her community. And my compositions have become more and more this kind of confluence, like a montage of sorts, where the background points to the larger story of the people I'm painting. Like in this case, Talavera, which is from a craft from Puebla, where this family is from, and then the New York Times that points to their place, the place where they are located now in New York, in Queens. And this was, this painting on the left is an artist that has inspired me for a long time, Sylvia, a painting of hers from 1977 of the AIR feminist group. And later on, I was asked to be in residence at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York. And so I decided to paint every woman that was on this residency, and I'm there as well, looking over at them. They led various NGOs and were community leaders themselves. And in the background, I put a poster by Rafael Vasquez of women marching towards their union. So it's kind of this idea of female solidarity. I don't have the image of the print right here, but it's from a historic poster. This is Kehan, who ran the group who was the organizer for this group of women. And she's also, well, she's a writer herself. She wrote a book on kind of pedagogy and theater to kind of help communities make social justice claims. So I've painted her once or twice, and in this particular painting, I went to her home and I found this New York Times newspaper heading that said "Resistance begins at home." And this is, I think, the last image I'm going to show you. This is, again, Gustavo. And as the pandemic hit, I decided to end up making some watercolors and sending flowers to people that I had painted in Corona early on in 2012. I had also given Gustavo and his family a couple of paintings back in 2012, which we were thankfully able to, my gallery was able to sell them and give that money to this family to, you know, provides resources to help out during the pandemic when people were when they were particularly struggling with their job as well. So I think I'll stop my screen share for now and then welcome Tom to join me in conversation.
Hello, nice to see you, Aliza.
Nice to see you, Tom.
Pleasure to be with you on a snowy night in New York.
Thank you. It's a sunny day here in Los Angeles.
So you said that, you know, to pay attention to someone can be a political act. And with your previous paintings of undocumented immigrants, for instance, you were able to be together without a mask. You could look directly in their eyes while speaking and painting. You could share a laugh or drink tea and sit for long hours in a closed room, vulnerable to each other. And your subjects were also the first witnesses of your work. So they were made in a different way. They were made in the same room as a subject sat, very different than the NHS paintings. Obviously with Zoom, we can't look at each other directly in the eye, we watch one another while we also watch ourselves, which is a very potentially chilly, closed loop. But your paintings are so warm and so alive. And that's what I'm really curious about is how did you've talked a little bit in showing the slides and especially reading stuff, but I was so struck thinking about the difference between you working alone in the studio and with the computer and those phone calls versus your previous practice of just that intimacy, that transference that happens when you paint with someone in the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was such a different way of working, and for a long time I debated. I was about to go to Liverpool and do it there, and then there was all these bans, and I was like, I won't be able to come back if I go and do it from life. So it provided a very interesting, different type of reflection, I guess, because, for example, Kalin, what I would spend around an hour initially Zoom conversing with each one of the NHS subjects that I painted. And Kalin, for example, took me on a tour of his home and showed me all the watercolor artists from Scotland that he collects. And I got a sense of their home settings, which I wouldn't have had otherwise. And there was a lot of back and forth with email and Zoom, and a lot of time to reflect, for me to, go on walks and, as I was mentioning, and think about what flowers I wanted to send each person metaphorically through my watercolors. But you're right that the conversations weren't as direct. It was this lag of time that Zoom allows, but in some ways I had more time to think about the compositions without having that direct kind of energy that I get from people when I'm painting them from life. It's not to be underestimated, this sense of like presence, not only presence from a person, but also presence from artwork. When one sees an oil painting in person, there is a tremendous kind of like magical presence, I feel, which is similar to the presence that you have when you encounter an individual. But it'll have to be in June when I finally, or May, whenever I finally get to meet them in person. At least we were able to have an opening for the sitters themselves, which they were very excited about.
It's amazing. Yeah, the living creatures, the living people move through this screen, this cold screen, and then end up, on the canvases, on the paintings, which have so much life in them. It's so interesting to me how you negotiate or collaborate with your sitters about how they're going to be seen. And there's a real digging into this idea of the public and the private self between those people. And that's, something that we all choose every day, what we wear, the face we present to others in the street. I wondered for you in making the paintings, how did they impact you in terms of your own personal feelings, your fears, your, anxieties around COVID? Because we have so much time in this period to reflect. And I imagine making paintings in this powerfully affirmative way was really helpful in a lot of ways. And I just wondered, kind of on a personal level, what you took away from that kind of intimate witnessing.
Well, it was so inspiring to hear how they were of service, how they just like put on their, like Navina spoke in the video, she was like, this is what we were called to do. This is why we chose to be a nurse or a doctor, and we'll do it. Or amazing stories like the woman who would blow bubbles and now she couldn't because of COVID, she would blow bubbles for children that had emergencies. So in a much lesser way, I was, during the whole time that I was working, I was thinking, I have to be sure not to get sick myself because I only have 3 months to put together this body of work, and I was very anxious myself to do this kind of tribute to them and to do them justice. And it was also a little bit nerve-wracking whether they would like the work in the end, because I wasn't showing, they weren't the first witnesses, as usually happens in my work. I remember when I was doing the underground piece, somebody would say, oh, my lips are too pink, change them, I don't like that, or put me next to this other person, change the composition around a little bit. But in this case, I was really, it was a mission, that I had to accomplish somehow. And I, as much as I wanted to go on hikes, sometimes I was like, no, I can't expose myself. I have to finish this and then I can start my life again or something, you know, and so I was really, it was very moving experience to have that film kind of be able to chronicle them and their experience. And they kept sending me emails, you know, as a way of corresponding. Like Lalith, I remember, who was one of the doctors that when you guys get to see the full video, he was talking about how he didn't have an experience of touching another human being during the whole 4 months during COVID, and how he would lie on his floor to kind of get a different tactile experience, you know. And he would send me correspondence of their music team at the hospital and their theater team at the hospital. If only we had those kinds of initiatives in hospitals here, you know. But it was really amazing to hear the back and forth. And since the exhibition closed, I've also, Kevin has sent me so many notes of his experience going back to see the work. So it's been really interesting.
It's amazing. We both have a basis or a foundation in, you know, in activism and activist art or social practice work. And I know that you studied psychology and actually considered being a social worker, which I find kind of amazing in your paintings. And I wondered, you know, it's very clear when I think about the work that you did with Tanya Bruguera at Immigrant Movement International, of combining this very practical transaction of helping someone to learn English, while then at the same time intimately witnessing them. And there's a kind of very practical political exchange that's happening in that. And I wondered how your thought about that kind of, the nature of that exchange has changed as the kind of collaborations you're doing have changed. You know, and when you go to Brixton and spend a very condensed time with people, but you don't know them in the same way, or don't spend that incremental time. I know myself, as being part of a collective, activist collective, the question of community and connection were always a kind of moving subject. And I wonder what your feelings of that are. That's
such a good question. That's such a good point. I feel like it has to shift with each different community I work with, you know, like with Immigrant Movement, it was about this, and it shifts as my career shifts as well, you know. So as my career was starting off with Tanya, I was, and in Chicago, I was always so captivated by people like her and Greg Bordowitz and his movement with ACT UP. He was my teacher in Chicago. I know we discussed this, and he was important to you as well. But with that, it's almost like it becomes a shifting sense of what your responsibility is to that community, and how to have some kind of depth if you are only coming in for 3 months, or, you know, or I've never done anything for less than 3 months, but the longest engagement has been this one with people that I've known for 8 years through Immigrant Movement, and who I've kept in touch with. And it becomes in some ways kind of a gift economy, where they are allowing me to make a representation of them. And then how can I get involved with the community, maybe share resources either with these English classes, or with kind of sharing the wider economy of like a certain percentage of the sale of my work that can go to the trusts of these hospitals, or how that can be worked into my work further as it goes on. But with Minneapolis, for example, it's you have to kind of gain the trust of each community that you are allowed to work with. You know, with Hope Community, it was a really long engagement beforehand of research and of talking to them and what we were going to do and how we were going to make videos of each one of the for Hope Community or Centro Tirón Guzmán, and share them with them so that they could also have a promotional video to distribute later on. Some kind of work that the museum would allow the community to take part. You know, we opened up the museum galleries for 8 months for programming to be done by these communities centers themselves inside the museum. So each, as I said, each group is different how I engage with them, or what they want, what they ask for. Yeah.
Absolutely. You paired your the NHS portraits and with still lives of flowers I especially love the painting of blue agapanthus paired with Stephen, I just learned his name today, holding a dog in front of dazzling yellow fabric patterned with peacocks. So, you've engaged with the agency of your subjects and, their social and political selves and identities as workers, but you're also an exuberant colorist. Your paintings pay attention to the surface, totally, but also what's below the surface. And this is something that probably the strongest area of connection I have with your work is we both share the desire to reconcile beauty with the imperatives of politics. I've spent most of my career being told those two things should be separated strongly. So I just wondered if you would comment your own opinion about that balancing act.
So did I. That's such a good, I agree that that's what we really share, like the kind of rhythmic nature of your work, where there's such a sense of musicality and aesthetics in the way you do your films, and how that might correlate to color as well in my painting. I think color, to start with color perhaps, it's something that hits you on a very kind of physical and affect level. It hits you before you have any story. And it's, in that sense, it's like smell, or it's less of an intellectual sense, it just hits you. And for me, one of the biggest challenges of making a painting is coming up with sometimes somewhat dissonant color choices or things that might not coexist, like in the Alder Hey painting. I remember I gave it a bright yellow sun, bright yellow sky. And obviously that's not a very British sky, but I was like, I want to, give them a little bit of LA sunshine, perhaps. But it's exactly that, how like aesthetics to me is very political also, because sometimes otherness, or whether it's like being from Mexico or being exuberant or being other, has always been paired with this idea of the colorful. And for example, when I was in Chicago, being a painter, it's so constructive when you have these polarizing voices, like Greg Bordowitz, who was my teacher. And he was like, I'm not sure that painting can engage my politics because it's not, it's not direct enough. And then we would talk about negative capability and all these things about how painting and aesthetics can hold that space in some ways. And I mean, I think that moment of political transformation can be very similar to a moment of aesthetic transformation.
Absolutely. I think it's a good moment, actually. I mean, it's funny to change subject to a connected subject of negative capability, what you were just saying. We have so many things in common beyond just interests. I discovered in doing research, we both have Scandinavian American mothers. And both of our fathers are Eastern European. My father was Lithuanian and yours is Russian. But on top of that, we both got MFAs from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where of course Carol was a dean, and that we both know her from there. And in reading a little bit more, I realized that you live with your sister Karen, who was studying while you were studying at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And she apparently introduced you to the work of the Lithuanian Jewish French philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas. And he wrote about, we talked about this in our conversation the other day, he talked about, the ethical obligation of us to remain open to other people, and the importance of face-to-face relationships. One of the things I love to read about him today, doing a little more research, is he preferred to think of philosophy as the wisdom of love rather than the love of wisdom, which I love that, whatever you call that oxymoron, that quick. But I just wondered if you talk about how his writing specifically has impacted your work, and that, this idea of, this ethical obligation to remaining open to other people, and sort of how that's made a profound impact on what you do.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for mentioning my family. They'll all be thrilled to hear themselves mentioned, as well as my stepmother, Emma, who also works who is a social worker and was very influential to me in Mexico growing up. But I think that when I was growing up with my sister, Kalin, and she was at the University of Chicago, she would talk a lot about this, interestingly enough, Levinas was also a phenomenologist. So he would say that he based his philosophy on a kind of phenomenological experience, which is that since another person is one of the only phenomenons that you can't fully comprehend ever their interiority, it's totally opaque to you, it elicits an ethical response, and the phenomenon of a face. And that was so interesting to me. I think my sister and I were really fascinated by this idea of ethics, and she's gone on to be a philosopher and works on this to this day. But when I was younger in Mexico City, when I started working in mental hospitals, and I started working in psychology and in mental hospitals, I started to think about, I was in practice kind of working with people, and then I had this long interlude of being trained as a figurative painter with people like Susanna Coffey, who taught me in Chicago to paint in this kind of passage method, which was like Cézanne, passage painting, kind of little bits of color put together. And then making these huge abstract heads when I was in grad school, thinking about this, like, how can one make a painting that correlates to this notion of the phenomenology of ethics in some ways, to actually putting it into practice again, working with individuals and, shifting each project to work with particular groups of people, and, and think about how to represent a workforce, but also this private sphere as well, like their alliances, how they assemble, their friendships, and then how they kind of go home and find these private moments, like you mentioned with Stephen, who also had a peacock tattoo to match his peacock curtains, which I really loved, and he wanted to be painted that way. It wasn't my decision. But.
Yeah, I didn't realize until this week that the Jean-Pierre and Luc Dardenne, who are known as the Dardenne brothers, are very influenced by Levinas. I don't know if you know their films. They've made a number of films, like the film called L'Enfant or Rosetta. They're quite well known. They've won prizes at Cannes, et cetera. And they make a kind of film that focuses on behavior as a way, or externals as a way to think about the internal life of the character, or psychological life of the character. And this idea of, in Levinas, that encountering another is like a privileged phenomenon. I mean, there's a part of that that's attached to phenomenology, but almost in the hands of Levinas, it feels like Buddhism, or feels like a form of spirituality. Even though it's not, I don't know, I find that even though that it's very tinged with a kind of secular approach. Yeah, I don't know, I found there's a kind of mysticism embedded in this idea of witnessing, which I think has to do with, in your painting, has to do with initially, creating community from the individual relationships you had out of your life, and then built out from there to various other communities. And that process of community building through representation has a really long history in painting, and in different contexts. Sometimes it's been explicitly political, and other times not. It's in those ways, I think, for instance, in your group paintings recently, of the connection to things like Mexican mural painting. So we know the big names of Mexican mural painting, but in a more deep way, this idea of the role of group portraiture has, and about the meaning of imagining, I guess, or portraying a community, and also the practical sense of like what it does in terms of actually creating a community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The idea of creating a community, because sometimes in putting people into a particular configuration, new alliances might even come up. I'm usually just the observer of their workforce, but I remember I also painted everyone that works at the gallery that represents me in New York, Anton Kern, when I had a show there, and then they were thinking, I was basing it a little bit on this painting, on Courbet's group paintings, and another painting of Cézanne that he ended up painting all these different art dealers together, and this interest of thinking about the community at the gallery, the paintings of other artists at the gallery that I love, and just how different configurations might come about when you think about assembly. You know, Fred Moten talks about rethinking our modes of assembly, how people during this time, well, especially in the Trump years, but even now, how we have to always rethink our modes of assembling as a workforce and how to be creative and reorganizing them so that they become more dynamic in some ways. So
Yeah.
it's so interesting to have an inside view of a workforce, you know, like at Alder Hay Children's Hospital, where they each were sharing this experience of teen time on Zoom, talking about their stories and trying to make an image of them, of those stories through the drawings I asked them to make.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you said actually something before about this idea of bringing people together, that revolutionary moments are always made when different people come into solidarity with each other. Which is also, I mean, honestly, because you could think of the elections in Georgia that just happened as a revolutionary moment in America, about kind of people coming together in a really pragmatic way. I mean, what just happened in the elections, I consider a kind of revolutionary moment of people coming together. And there are people who are, I'm lucky enough to look in the attendees list, and a number of our colleagues at this university who have been as worried about the presidential election and as engaged in a political way. And the political community of that activism is such a profound gift. Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting to think of this moment as like my position as one of allyship, you know, and how I can align myself, not necessarily make visible, but how I can align myself with particular groups or individuals, and if I can shift some resources, if I can make images, you know, that might also not have been there historically in oil painting. It's interesting, but yes, like what happened in Georgia, and even artists like Walk the Walk and all these organizations that were heavily involved in grassroots organizing. And I mean, I started to learn so much about like kind of relational organizing also, you know, which is always about really mouth to mouth organizing and not doing it from afar, but being from grassroots, from the bottom up, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to remind the audience that we welcome your questions in the chat. Aliza and I are going to talk for a bit longer, and then I welcome questions from you in the chat. You mentioned Gustave Courbet. I'm hoping that the audience knows, but if not, Gustave Courbet was a painter in the 19th century, considered very influential because of the shift his paintings marked towards a kind of realism. You know, people also would consider Flaubert, the writer, the novelist, to have a kind of corollary position of shifting things towards realism. But there's another moment that I was thinking about in relationship to your work, which is the 1960s, and movements, for instance, like Fluxus, which tried to erase the barrier between art and life, or that put action at the center of art practice. And I've just spent a long period, about a 5-year period of time, looking very closely at the films of Andy Warhol, which are essentially about duration and time. And one of the things I was thinking about your paintings, because we talked about this, is the role of time in your paintings. I mean, you know, I went to graduate school, and when you made video art or performance art, it was called time-based mediums. And painting, you know, my undergraduate degree was in painting and my master's degree was in video art. So I shift from a non-time-based medium to a time-based medium. But, you know, painting is absolutely a time-based medium in every way. And time is experienced in multiple ways. You know, while you have this meditative space to reflect on who you're painting, the subject might relax in the same way I do at the barber. Like I fall asleep. It is the most tender way of being paid attention to when my hair is being cut. And I imagine being painted must feel like that kind of tender attention. And then of course there's, you know, to the time that the viewer brings or doesn't bring to your painting. Like I, as a painter, in the earlier stage of my career, one of the frustrations was I sometimes wanted to make the viewer have a longer experience with my work. And I shifted to film because I could say, here's 90 minutes, you have to see 90 minutes. So anyways, I just wondered how you think about time in your art, because it's not a subject we generally talk about in painting, but in your work, somehow it seems very present as a subject.
I love that question. I think that I think about it very much in terms of this this witnessing kind of the way I paint is like a cumulative register in some ways of time spent with somebody. So it's very slow, and I usually mix my colors for like an hour while they just came to my studio, and put on a movie for them or something, give them some coffee and some snacks so that they'll relax. And literally it's like an energetic thing in some ways, because if they're wiggling their foot too much or they're jittery, I can't paint them, you know. And so it's very much about the kind of a collaborative method in some ways. And because of the detail I put into my work, I guess it hopefully will allow for a longer experience. But I love how painting is this idea of painting being a unity as well. You know, Morris Louis used to say that he would run through museums and whatever caught his eye, he would stop, you know. So I love this idea of like both fast. You take in a painting in terms of its harmony, its color, first very quickly, and then you slow down and look at the cumulative moments of this register of faces, etc. But I agree that why is painting called not a time-based medium? It's so lengthy, and it's so, and exactly, the viewer should hopefully spend time with it. I don't know if Susan Bernofsky just asked me this question or if she asked all of us this question, but it's an interesting one. It goes into what I was saying. She asked, when you paint people who are undergoing trauma, do you feel it in your body too? Which is quite interesting. And I've never thought about that, but yeah, I guess I do on an unconscious level. When I was painting women at Immigrant Movement International, they told me I was painting somebody that had closed their eyes, and all of a sudden they didn't want to keep their eyes closed. And it was for a particular private story that they had told me. But sometimes, like you said, Tom, it's not a therapeutic space because I'm not a therapist, but this spending time with somebody really allows for a very gentle kind of conversation or very intimate moments to come through. And it's a little bit difficult. You know, I try to do the best I can. I mean, it's a limited amount of time I have with them, 3 to 6 hours or so when they're sitting with me, maybe 2 sessions, but I don't experience the trauma very directly myself, but I hope it can be at least healing for them to have this time with me or to be represented somehow.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I wonder, I mean, there's such a long history. One of the kind of bold choices in your work, of course, is changing the dynamic of who is painted in a portrait. We have such a long history, of course, of royalty or aristocrats being painted. And in that case, the dynamics of compensation were usually reversed. So the, person painting might be paid by the king or whoever, compensated in some way for making that painting. But a central part of your work has been, the remuneration or compensation or collaboration within your work with the subject. And I wondered if you talk about how that's evolved over time. And I can imagine it's very different than the questions, for instance, Grand Fury had when the art world started paying attention to us, but it probably isn't entirely different as you embraced the larger platform and reach of your work and then tried to navigate questions of authenticity or ethics in the practice itself as the scale of what you're doing became more visible, and the stakes became higher.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ongoing question and an ongoing thing to consider, because when I first started, my work wasn't selling, and when I gave Gustavo and Veronica their first paintings, they kept them in their home, and now they were able to capitalize on that, and during the pandemic sell those works, and right now it's a certain percentage of the sales of the work that will go into these trusts for the NHS. That's how I'm working with it. But it's also, like I said, it's not limited to that kind of monetary exchange, because in some ways that's also kind of simplistic, because it's in some ways what's enough, what's enough in terms of like the skill that I have and how I might put that to this history of painting and being in discussion with the history of painting and representation and having that work enter into public institutions when possible. But also, it's also like a matter of kind of these other kind of not so much about remuneration, but gift exchange in terms of energy and attention and helping with college entrance exams or other things that might be about other resources that I might have as a teacher as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm at the official time when I'm supposed to open to questions from the audience. We've had a couple. We had one from Susan, just encouraging you others if you want to ask questions. Otherwise, I will yak because I'm always a yacker and I have no problems doing that. I was thinking about, there's a filmmaker and theater director named Elia Kazan, who's a bit of a controversial figure because, of course, people may or may not know, he testified actually at the HUAC hearings, which were the House Un-American Committee hearings, and was vilified for that in a lot of ways. But regardless of that, he said about directing, he said that in the end, film directing consists of turning psychology into behavior, which for me was probably the most profound thing anybody ever, I read of anything when I thought about narrative filmmaking. Because I had been trained as a painter and I'd worked as an actor as a kid in theater and in high school, but sort of seriously, but not completely. And I began to realize that, what you're doing is trying to show what's hidden inside a character. You're trying to explore the line between public and private. And there are private things that we reveal in public, sometimes quite unconsciously. And I was thinking in your paintings, like I was thinking, for instance, how there's this thing, ineffable things that get expressed, like in the painting of Navina and the beautiful exuberant tangle of hair in that painting. And that, I don't know what it reveals psychologically, but it's incredibly expressive. Like I feel like your paintings often show me something I'm surprised to see based on the potential social face of these characters. I think of, especially in the time of COVID, you don't see a healthcare worker often because they have to be masked or concealed. But yeah, anyways, I just wondered what your feelings are about this idea of the kind of private or public of people, or this idea of how you try to look at something external, behavioral, or in the way they dress that reveals who they are inside. Does that relate to the way you work?
Yeah, that's such a good. Well, in some ways, it goes back to your comment about the blurring of boundaries between art and life. And painting is always something that's framed. And I used to have all these conversations with Tanya about painting in relation to her work, and when I'd go into the Immigrant Movement International, and because of the frame of painting, that supposedly that was its limit, but I think it's just very interesting to think about this larger framing, or how including subjects into the being not only the first witnesses, but also the first party of the, at the opening. But for example, Navina wanted to travel the world. She was about to embark on a trip around the world as she graduated as a student nurse. And instead we were kind of debating whether I should paint her with this mural that she had of the whole world in the back of her in her room, or this book that she was reading because of her curiosity. And so this, I've always been interested in this idea of painting people when they're for themselves, not in some ways not engaged with the viewer, not about a kind of cliche that might be thought of in terms of immigrants or some kind of cliches about who they might be, but instead the group that they run marathons with, or some other experiences of their life, or other aspects that show how the political might not be able to interfere with this, with their home or their internal life. Although obviously, as we know in feminism, the personal does become political as well, So I'm just interested in those moments where they are for themselves.
Yeah. We have a comment from one of our viewers, Maureen Sweeney, who says that being seen is profoundly vulnerable. Your care absolutely comes through, and she thanks you, Aliza. And a question from Rachel Adams is, Aliza, can you speak more about Sylvia Slay's influence on your work? I'm a huge fan of her work and would love to know more about your own interest.
Yeah, her and Alice Neal are some of my biggest influences, and you mentioned, for example, the muralists in Mexico. This kind of notion of the group portrait as ideological, the kind of movement of social history in some ways, is less interesting to me than these private moments that Alice Neal and Sylvia Slay were able to depict. Sylvia Slay, her husband was, I forget, who was he? Lawrence Alloway, or was an art critic, and he would talk a lot of, she was in this marriage, which was all about so many different art discourses, but she would depict her immediate sphere, and Alice Neal would depict her community in Harlem, also from life very often. So I just love those painters and the kind of vulnerability that they express in their work.
Yeah, no, Alice Neal. So those paintings in Harlem are as intimately witnessed as that painting of Andy Warhol wearing a surgical corset. By far the best portrait of Warhol ever done.
And the color in that painting, that painting in particular influenced me so much. The kind of coolness of blues and purples that show that vulnerability in the skin is just amazing.
No, totally. We have a question. Are there certain qualities of a person that make them more or less paintable to you? Are there subjects you find difficult to paint? Can you paint anyone? And it's just the name is withheld of that person.
I think, sometimes I've made aesthetic choices in terms of who to paint. In this case, with the healthcare workers, I only chose the people that seem to have done the most service, so I felt like I could paint pretty much whoever wanted to be painted, and as long as I had enough photographs to choose from and to take from, and as long as they allow me a little bit of creative license, because I've had people say, why don't you make my skin more smooth, like Renaissance paintings or something? So that's difficult when we go into this discussion about contemporary art and why I'm painting them in this way that's not perfectly smooth skinned, or what my historic influences might be. And the only people, when I'm painting somebody, and I have had a few instances where they're very impatient and they don't give it the proper time, I might just put on some kind of thriller or something that keeps them engaged while I'm painting them. So sometimes I have painted to murder mysteries going on and people getting killed in the background while I'm painting. So it's really interesting to see the things people are asked to do while I'm painting them.
Funny. I have another question for you, which is for the Tate show, did the stories that people were telling you influenced how you painted them? If so, how? And this is from your sister, Karen.
Oh, okay. Yes, absolutely. Like the kind of relationships, who I decided to pair, for example, in that large painting with the Alder Hey Team Time group, I decided to paint Lalith with Joe, who was the other co-organizer for Team Time as the directors of this whole group. I paired Kevin with two women who were his friends, and they were kind of chatting and laughing in the park when they were interviewed. And so, yes, I always paint them in terms of their relationships. In the Brixton painting, we invited them all quite a few times to have tea and cookies so that I could kind of observe the relationships, the friendships, and who would be paired next to each other.
Absolutely.
And I have to be kind of keen on their body language and think about the different positions where they come alive in some ways.
How much instruction did you have to give that photographer? because that was a new element to making the work for sure.
Quite a bit. He would talk to the sitters, and I would talk to them. Then some of the sitters would send me various different outfits that they might want to be painted with different places in their home, or, it was a lot of back and forth between the three elements.
It's interesting to think, I was just thinking of this now about Alice Neal, and, David Hockney was more commercially famous or successful during that period in the 70s, but both were kind of attacked for being figurative painters in a period of time. It ran so against, minimalism and conceptual work, and, the shift away from studio practices of that time. And it's interesting to think about that now because, figurative painting is having, in the short attention span of the world, it's being revived, but in the bigger picture, figurative painting is still a kind of embattled or questioned sight. And I think of that as just an interesting thing historically, and also who is it a contested site with? In other words, like the art, the minutia of the art world, parsing where figurative painting lands in relationship to, like, quote unquote post-studio art practice is a very arcane question. To the people who worked at the NHS, and to be hanging in the Tate Liverpool and have their painting there seems like a much less complicated notion of the role of art. Anyways, I just think about that, about sort of how things have changed so much about how we think of figurative.
Absolutely. Like even in during my career, when I was coming up as an artist and I was an abstract painter, and there was so much like conceptual, although not that my work is not conceptual, but there was so much discussion about these kind of interior discussions about the art world, and for example, in Mexico, figurative painting hasn't really taken hold because there's such a history of muralism, that there's still very much of an interest in dematerial kind of art practices. But I think there has been a turn a lot towards simple humanistic values, not simple, but this idea of representation or humanism again, which might have a strong, more of a line between discourses that are a little bit easier for the general public to understand and the art world, perhaps come from a humanistic vantage point. And I think there's much more patience for that, or need for that in the art world, when perhaps it's also more of a relationship to art and public life in some ways.
For sure. I think of the way that things have changed in our culture. As a teenager, I was born in 1962. So in the late 70s, when I first saw the paintings of David Hockney pairing gay couples, gay men, I had realized, I'd never seen that before in an easel painting. Something I now take for granted. You can, watch a network television and see a queer couple. And finally seeing those paintings in that retrospective in the Met, I cried actually because of the connection of that, or the importance of that. And I think of the way that your work probably will have that kind of resonance from some of the subjects, or just in the bigger discourse of how people will turn to those paintings as a reflection of either people they know, or in the bigger sense, pictures that helped give a tangible form to the feelings of identity that they want to have, the place in the world that they want to have. So I love the idea that your work is part of a living connection in history, but also will move forward over time.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
Of course. It's been a total delight, all of us being together. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to lead us out by looking at a little bit more from the NHS video, talking about Aliza's work. And I want to let the audience know that we're going to open the chat now so that it can be read and seen by all. So if you have comments or enthusiasms you want to share with our guest of the hour, Aliza, please do. And I want to thank you all for being with us. It's been a delight, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom. What a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
And
thank
with
you.
Wow,
That looks amazing.
thank you. It's brilliant.
That is incredible. I love my color.
I decided not to put all of the pattern, Joe, of your shirt, just a little bit so that we would have.
Oh, I love it.
A really warm Liverpool welcome awaits you, really.
There you are. Let me show you closer up here.
I can't believe that to me. That's so insane.
It's so good to see you again. It's been a good 3 or 4 months since we last spoke. Let me show you this watercolor I did of you.
I like this. My mother always used to sit like this. Sadly, she's passed on now, but a lot of the photographs we've got of her are all like this. So yeah, it's quite poignant.
It's like various different moments of time that are kind of brought together in a portrait.
Never thought I'd be hanging on a wall in the St. Gallery. But yeah, so that's a privilege, really.
You know, to be a painting on a wall is longevity.
I'm so honored that Aliza has painted us because we have to bring to the public conversation what it has been like working during this pandemic.
I think there's a little bit more appreciation as to what we do and what our job entails. So the perception is very much changed.
Hopefully at the end of the exhibit, I'll be able to actually travel and meet them in person and see the hospital that I painted. I can't wait to actually somehow be face to face with them in the end. I'm very excited for this exhibition to be present soon in December so that they can go and find renewal when they come and see the paintings.